Hello, friends. Turning 70 is a milestone, isn't it? It's a chapter in life that's filled with reflections, lessons, and changes we never imagined facing when we were younger. One moment, you're in your 20s, full of energy, dreams, and plans. And the next, you're in your 70s, looking back on decades of memories and wondering, how did time fly by so quickly? Now let me be clear. Avoiding people doesn't mean I've turned bitter or given up on relationships. Quite the opposite, in fact. It's about choosing peace, valuing my time, and protecting the space I've worked so hard to create in this stage of life. And if you're in your 60s, 70s, or beyond, you might find that this resonates with you too. In today's video, I want to take you through this journey, why I made this choice, the lessons it's taught me, and how it's brought a new sense of freedom and contentment. We'll talk about the value of time, the evolution of relationships, and the power of solitude. By the end of this, I hope you'll feel inspired to reflect on your own life, and maybe even share your story in the comments. After all, life at this stage is about connection, even if it looks different than it used to. Before we dive in, let me ask you something. Have you ever found yourself pulling away from people, not out of anger, but because it feels peaceful? If you have, tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts because this is a journey many of us share, even if we don't talk about it often. If you enjoy content that speaks to your heart and inspires you to live life authentically, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a video that's made just for you. Let's get started. 1. Time feels more precious than ever. Let me share a story with you about a woman named Margaret. Margaret is 72, and like many of us, she spent most of her life giving everything she had to her family, her career, and her community. She raised 3 kids, worked as a teacher for 35 years, and was the kind of person who never missed a birthday, a school play, or a neighborhood gathering. Margaret had a full calendar and a full heart. But after her husband passed away 5 years ago, something shifted. At first, Margaret tried to keep busy. She joined book clubs, volunteered, and made an effort to stay connected with everyone in her life. Yet, no matter how busy she stayed, there was this growing feeling inside her, this realization that time felt different now. It wasn't something she could ignore. One day, as Margaret was sitting in her garden, she found herself watching the birds flutter around the feeders. She wasn't doing anything in particular, just sipping tea and letting the sunlight warm her face. In that quiet moment, it hit her. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about what needed to be done or who she needed to call. She was just there, fully present, and it felt like a gift. From that day forward, Margaret began to look at time in a whole new way. She stopped saying yes to every invitation and started choosing moments that felt meaningful. Instead of rushing through her days, she began savoring them. She'd wake up early to watch the sunrise, take long walks by the river, and spend quiet afternoons reading books she'd always meant to finish. Margaret's story teaches us an important lesson. Time isn't just about how much of it we have, it's about how we use it. When we're young, time feels infinite, like we can waste it freely, because there will always be more. But as we grow older, we realize how precious it truly is. It's not about filling every moment with activity or every space with people. It's about slowing down and choosing quality over quantity. So, if you're in your golden years and find yourself feeling the weight of time, remember this. It's okay to take a step back. It's okay to protect your time and spend it on what brings you peace and joy. Like Margaret, you might discover that the quiet moments, those little pockets of stillness, are the ones that truly matter. 2. The changing nature of relationships. Let me share another story, this time about Robert. At 75, Robert has lived a life full of connections. He was the life of every party in his younger years, a man who remembered everyone's name, sent holiday cards to dozens of friends, and always had a story to share. His house was once filled with laughter, family dinners, and neighbors dropping by unannounced. But as the years went on, Robert began to notice something. Relationships, even the ones that felt unshakable, started to change. His children grew up and moved to different states, building their own lives. Friends he'd known for decades began drifting away. Some moved, some got busy, and some, heartbreakingly, passed on. It wasn't sudden, but over time Robert's social circle grew smaller. At first, Robert took these changes personally. He wondered if he had done something wrong. Why weren't people reaching out like they used to? Why did some relationships feel harder to maintain? But then, after a long conversation with his sister, he had a realization. Relationships change because people change, and that's not always a bad thing. One day, Robert decided to stop focusing on who wasn't in his life and start cherishing who still was. He began nurturing the relationships that mattered most to him: his sister, his neighbor who always checked in on him, and a close friend he'd known since college. Instead of spreading himself thin trying to keep every connection alive, Robert chose depth over breadth. This shift brought Robert a sense of peace. He no longer felt the need to attend every event or maintain relationships that had become one-sided. Instead, he poured his energy into the people who truly cared for him. And while his social circle was smaller, it was richer than ever. Robert's story is a reminder that it's okay for relationships to evolve as we age. Not every connection is meant to last forever, and that's part of life's beauty. The people who stay by your side are often the ones who truly matter. And just like Robert, we can find joy in those deeper, more meaningful bonds. So, if you found yourself reflecting on the relationships in your life, ask yourself this: which ones bring you joy? Which ones feel like home? Those are the relationships worth holding on to. 3. The fragility of trust. Now let me tell you about Eleanor, an 80-year-old woman who carries a heart full of wisdom and stories, some joyful and others painful. Eleanor spent her life believing in the goodness of people. She was the type of person who trusted easily, always ready to lend a helping hand or share a kind word. But over the years, life taught her that trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. One of Eleanor's most painful lessons came from someone she considered a close friend. They had shared years of memories, laughter, and support. But when Eleanor needed help during a difficult time, her friend didn't show up. Worse, she later discovered that this friend had been speaking negatively about her behind her back. Eleanor was devastated. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the realization that someone she trusted deeply didn't value her the same way. For a long time, Eleanor felt guarded. She stopped opening up to new people, afraid of being hurt again. But as she reflected on her experiences, she realized something profound. Trust isn't just about others, it's about trusting herself. She learned to trust her instincts, to recognize red flags, and to value her own boundaries. One of Eleanor's favorite sayings now is, "A fragile heart doesn't mean a weak one." She understands that while trust may take longer to build in her later years, it's worth the effort when it's given to the right people. She no longer feels guilty for keeping her circle small or for saying no to relationships that don't feel reciprocal. Eleanor's story reminds us that trust becomes more precious as we age. It's not about building walls so high that no one can climb them. It's about creating gates that let the right people in while keeping harm out. And while trust may be fragile, it's also resilient when placed in the hands of those who deserve it. So, if you've ever felt cautious about trusting others, know this: it's okay to take your time. It's okay to protect your heart, and it's okay to prioritize your peace. Eleanor's journey teaches us that trust isn't about how quickly we give it. It's about how wisely we choose to. 4. The world feels different now. Let me introduce you to Henry, a 78-year-old man who often sits on his front porch, watching the world go by. Henry grew up in a time when life felt slower, simpler, and more connected. Neighbors were like family. Children played freely in the streets, and people took the time to really know one another. But now, when Henry looks around, he can't help but feel that the world has changed in ways that make him nostalgic for those earlier days. Henry remembers a time when people would stop by unannounced just to say hello, a time when families gathered not out of obligation, but out of genuine love and joy. We didn't have smartphones or social media, he says, but we had each other. Conversations weren't rushed, and relationships weren't transactional. There was a sense of belonging, a warmth that didn't require effort to maintain. But as the years went on, Henry noticed that people became busier, more distracted, and often more distant. Technology, while convenient, seemed to create barriers rather than connections. While Henry appreciates being able to video call his grandchildren, he misses the days when they'd sit on his lap, sharing stories in person. The constant hum of notifications and the rush of modern life feel overwhelming to him at times. One moment that stands out to Henry happened last Christmas. His family visited, but everyone spent more time on their phones than talking to each other. He found himself sitting in the corner, watching them scroll through their screens, and he felt a pang of sadness. Are we losing what really matters? He wondered. Yet, Henry doesn't dwell on the negatives. Instead, he's found ways to adapt while holding on to what's important to him. He turns off his phone during dinner, takes walks without headphones, and makes an effort to connect with people face to face. He values the rare moments of uninterrupted conversation and cherishes the simple joys of human connection. Henry's story reminds us that while the world may feel different, we don't have to let go of what matters most. It's okay to step away from the noise, to create space for real connection, and to hold on to the values that make life meaningful. As Henry often says, the world may change, but kindness, love, and community will always matter. So if you've ever felt overwhelmed by the pace of modern life, take a moment to pause, turn off the distractions, reach out to someone you care about, and remember what it feels like to truly connect. Because even in a changing world, the power of human connection never fades. 5. Solitude isn't loneliness. Let me tell you about Grace, a 74-year-old widow who once feared being alone. For most of her life, Grace believed that solitude meant loneliness. She filled her days with people and activities, thinking that staying busy would keep those feelings at bay. But as time went on, she realized that being alone wasn't something to fear, it was something to cherish. After her husband passed, Grace felt an overwhelming sense of emptiness. Her house was quiet, her calendar less full, and the phone calls from friends seemed to grow fewer over time. At first, she tried to fight the solitude by joining clubs, attending social events, and keeping herself as busy as possible. But no matter how much she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. One day, Grace decided to do something different. Instead of filling her time with distractions, she embraced the quiet. She started spending her mornings by the window with a cup of tea, watching the birds and feeling the warmth of the sunlight. She began journaling, reflecting on her life and the lessons she'd learned. And slowly, she discovered a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in years. Grace found that solitude wasn't loneliness. It was a chance to reconnect with herself. She began to appreciate the small joys in life, the sound of rain on the roof, the smell of her favorite flowers, the feeling of a good book in her hands. These moments, though simple, became her sanctuary. She also realized that solitude gave her the energy to fully enjoy the relationships that truly mattered. When her grandchildren visited, she was present, savoring every laugh and hug. When she caught up with old friends, she listened more deeply and spoke with intention. Her time alone made these connections even more meaningful. Grace's story is a reminder that being alone doesn't mean being lonely. It's about finding comfort in your own company and appreciating the quiet moments that life has to offer. Solitude isn't a sign of isolation. It's a sign of strength and self-love. So if you've ever hesitated to spend time alone, take a page from Grace's book. Use those moments to rediscover what makes you happy, reflect on your life, and find peace in the stillness. Because sometimes the greatest joy comes not from the noise of the world, but from the quiet of your own heart. 6. Why I avoid people. Now, let's talk about James, a 70-year-old retired engineer who once prided himself on being the go-to person for everyone. James was the type of man who always said yes, whether it was helping a neighbor fix their car, attending every family gathering, or staying late at work to help a colleague meet a deadline. He thrived on being needed and was known for his kindness and reliability. But over time, James started to feel something he couldn't quite explain. He felt drained, as though he was giving more of himself than he could replenish. He began to notice that some people only reached out when they needed something, never to simply ask how he was doing. Relationships that once brought him joy started to feel one-sided, and he realized he was spending more time fulfilling others' expectations than taking care of his own well-being. The turning point came when James experienced a health scare, a mild heart attack that forced him to reevaluate his priorities. As he recovered, he realized that his constant need to please others was taking a toll on his physical and emotional health. It was then that James made a decision. He would start saying no, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. James began to distance himself from relationships and obligations that left him feeling empty. He stopped answering calls from people who only reached out when they needed something. He started prioritizing his peace, his hobbies, and the relationships that truly mattered. It wasn't an easy transition. There were moments of guilt and doubt. But over time, James discovered a profound sense of freedom. Now, James spends his days doing what brings him joy. He works on woodworking projects in his garage, goes fishing with a close friend, and takes long walks in the park. He still values relationships, but he's learned to be selective about where he invests his time and energy. And in doing so, he's found a balance that brings him peace. James's story reminds us that avoiding people isn't about shutting the world out. It's about creating space for what truly matters. It's about protecting your peace, nurturing the relationships that uplift you, and letting go of the ones that don't. So, if you've ever felt like you're carrying the weight of too many obligations, take a moment to reflect. Are the people in your life bringing you joy, or are they leaving you drained? Like James, you have the right to choose what's best for you, and to embrace the freedom that comes with it. 7. Does this sound familiar? Finally, let me share the story of Diane, a 68-year-old retired nurse who recently found herself asking a question many of us might relate to. Is it just me, or do relationships feel harder as we get older? Diane had always been someone who gave her all to others, her patients, her family, her friends. She believed that being a good person meant being there for everyone, no matter what. But as Diane entered her late 60s, she started noticing something she hadn't expected. Maintaining relationships felt more like a chore than a joy. She often found herself wondering, why am I always the one reaching out? Why do I feel so drained after spending time with certain people? These questions led Diane to reevaluate her relationships and, more importantly, her expectations. Diane realized that much of her younger life had been spent trying to meet other people's needs, often at the expense of her own. She would say yes to things she didn't want to do, stay in touch with people who didn't make an effort, and invest in relationships that gave little in return. Over time, this pattern left her feeling unappreciated and, frankly, exhausted. One day, Diane decided to take a step back. She stopped initiating calls to people who never called her first. She began saying no to events that didn't bring her joy. And most importantly, she stopped feeling guilty for choosing herself. To her surprise, this didn't make her feel lonely, it made her feel free. Diane's story speaks to a common experience for many older adults, the realization that it's okay to prioritize quality over quantity when it comes to relationships. It's okay to let go of connections that no longer serve you, and to embrace the peace that comes with focusing on what truly matters. If Diane's story sounds familiar, you're not alone. Many of us reach a point in life where we start to value our time and energy more than ever. We become more selective about who we let into our lives, and that's not a sign of selfishness, it's a sign of wisdom. So let me ask you, have you found yourself making similar choices? Have you started pulling away from relationships that no longer feel fulfilling? If so, I encourage you to see this not as a loss but as a gain. It's a step toward living authentically and protecting your peace. 8. Embracing this chapter. Let me tell you about Carol, a 71-year-old who spent much of her life chasing goals, meeting expectations, and always looking ahead to the next thing. Carol worked tirelessly, raised her family, and checked off countless achievements on her list. But as she entered her 70s, she realized something profound. This stage of life isn't about doing more, it's about being more. Carol's epiphany came during a quiet morning on her porch. As she watched the sunrise, she felt a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in years. For once, there was no rush, no pressure, no need to be anywhere but in that moment. Why didn't I live like this before? She wondered. The answer was simple. She had always been chasing something, whether it was career success, family milestones, or societal expectations. Now, Carol sees her 70s as a chapter of reflection and celebration. She reflects on her life not with regret, but with gratitude. There were triumphs that filled her with pride, mistakes that taught her resilience, and heartbreaks that shaped her character. Each experience, no matter how small, contributed to the person she is today. But embracing this chapter isn't just about looking back. It's also about looking forward. Carol has found joy in the little things she once overlooked. The warmth of her dog curled up by her feet, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, and the laughter of her grandchildren during their visits. These moments, though simple, bring her more happiness than any grand achievement ever did. One of the most liberating lessons Carol has learned is the power of saying no. No to obligations that drain her, no to relationships that feel one-sided, and no to the constant need to prove herself. Instead, she says yes to what truly matters, her peace, her passions, and her well-being. Carol's story is a reminder that aging isn't about slowing down. It's about shifting focus. It's about letting go of what no longer serves you and making space for the things that bring you joy. It's about living authentically and unapologetically, free from the pressures of others' expectations. If you've ever felt that this stage of life is more about endings than beginnings, Carol's story offers a different perspective. This chapter is an opportunity to embrace who you are, cherish what you've built, and find peace in simply being. So, as you reflect on your own journey, ask yourself, what brings you joy? What are you ready to let go of? And most importantly, how can you make this chapter of life your most meaningful yet? 9. Letting go of regrets. Let's talk about Marie, a 73-year-old who, for much of her life, carried a heavy burden, regrets. Like many of us, Marie often found herself replaying moments from her past, wishing she had done things differently. She regretted not pursuing a career she was passionate about, not spending more time with her children when they were young, and holding on to grudges that had cost her meaningful relationships. But one day, while sorting through an old box of family photos, something shifted. Marie came across a picture of herself in her 30s, surrounded by her children at a park. She remembered how happy she was in that moment, not because everything was perfect, but because she was present. She realized that while she may not have done everything right, she had done her best with what she knew at the time. From that day forward, Marie made a choice to let go of regrets and focus on gratitude. She started each morning by writing down 3 things she was thankful for. She forgave herself for past mistakes and embraced the lessons they had taught her. And she found peace in knowing that life's imperfections are what make it beautiful. Marie's story reminds us that it's never too late to let go of the past. Regret is a heavy load to carry, but gratitude can lighten the burden. By focusing on the good in your life, no matter how small, you can transform regret into appreciation. If you found this video meaningful, please give it a thumbs up, share it with someone who might need to hear these words, and subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for being part of this community. Here's to living life on your own terms and embracing the peace we all deserve. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.